The Spanish Armada at the time, they were the global hegemon at the time. They're not in the modern understanding of that because during that time period, France was involved in a 30 years internal civil war, part of the wars of religion that were taking place in the 16th century. And Philip tried to conquer England after the execution of Mary First of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, on the orders of Elizabeth Tudor, Queen Elizabeth I of England, who was queen from 1559 until her death in 1603 when Elizabeth died and King James I of England and the Six of Scotland finally took the throne. And this will be one of many conflicts where England is fighting a global power or a hegemon of Europe in order to try to prevent one power in Europe from dominating the entire continent. It was the big fear that if one power ever dominated the continental Europe, that power would use the resources of Europe to try and conquer England, which happened repeatedly throughout British history and English history. First under Philip II of Spain, then by Louis XIV of France, then another one under Napoleon Bonaparte, and finally against Nazi Germany during World War II from 1939 till 1945. It was this fear and this reality as well that meant that English foreign policy and then British foreign policy was to prevent any one power in Europe dominating the continent in order to maintain English and British security and maintain its freedom and independence. It's why English foreign policy was to keep European empires out of the North American continent, which continued even after America gained its independence in 1783, after the American Wars of Independence from 1775 until 1783, and the ratification of its constitution in 1789. And that's why both powers, until this day, have fairly close relations, or at least have a good, strong dialogue. British foreign policy has been basically from the Glorious Revolution of 1688 until 1945, preventing any one power from dominating Europe, preventing Europe from being a united entity because it was a direct threat to British and English interests, and also because, again, the fear of invasion. The British developed a policy called uh, the fleet in being. That was where the British would have a fleet capable of fighting three of the great powers of Europe in terms of size, and that the majority of the fleet, called the Home Fleet, will maintain itself inside British home waters to prevent any power from successfully invading the country. And this would be maintained up until the ending of World War II in 1945. That's because after 1945, America took control of being the global policeman, the global hegemon and security, and because two global powers emerged in the aftermath and destruction of World War II, the Soviet Union and the British, and the Soviet Union and the Americans, and they fought a conflict called the Cold War from 1945 until 1989. The war never became hot, but it was a cold conflict where several proxy wars were fought between both powers. And during that time period, the British dismantled its empire, it dismantled its navy, and relied predominantly on the United States for its security. The reason for this massive turn of events was because having fought two world wars from 1914 to 1918, then the Second World War from 1939 until 1945, the British economy was exhausted, and it basically had enough of the empire building project. It had enough of maintaining massive armies, massive navies in order to protect its security. And what the United States did was get rid of all the bad actors in the world, put us all the Western world into one camp in order to defeat the Russians, and that kind of security arrangement is what maintained global peace until this day. Thank you for everybody for this podcast episode. I shall leave a link to my article on this topic so you can have a read it this yourself in your own time and you can digest this information. If you wish to send me any messages, got any questions, please feel free to message me on my Medium account, message me on the my Substack. In Substack is a message system, you can message me on there as well. Or if you're on YouTube, if you leave a comment, I will respond. Though if there is a plethora of comments, I will respond either by a video or by a quick message in bulk form. Thanks for listening, and peace. Welcome back, everybody, to the Renaissance Humanism podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about English and British foreign policy since the 17th century and in previous time periods before the 17th century and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The reason why I'm going to do this, because to understand history, you need context, and with that context, we can understand British foreign policy up until the end of World War II in 1945. To begin with, English foreign policy, or more accurately, the dynastic policy of its ruling dynasty after 1066 under the Norman and Plantagenet kings of England, ruled from 1066 until 1154, and then the Plantagenets that were an adjunct branch and more of a French orientated dynasty from 1154 when Henry II became king, called Henry Fitz-Empress, until the Plantagenets dynasty was destroyed by the Tudors at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, where Henry Tudor, a Anglo-Welsh dynasty, took on the English crown after winning the Battle of Bosworth and killing the last Yorkist and Plantagenet King of England, King Richard III. Now, English foreign policy, or more accurately the Norman and Plantagenet foreign policy, we've got to go back to the 1050s. During the 1050s, the Capetian kings of France, or the Capet kings of France, depending which terminology and which name you prefer to use, they just took the throne in 987, and during that time period, the first century of Capetian rule, from the 987 until the beginning of the 12th century, was incredibly weak. They were limited to the crown lands around Paris, and during that time period, there was a battle going off in northern France, like Game of Thrones. We had the Capet dynasty, we had the Angevin dynasty in Anjou, we had the Norman dynasty in Normandies, and we had the Flemish dynasty in Flanders, and the Brittany dynasty in Brittany, all fighting and dominating to see who can dominate northern France. Though the King of France, or the King of the Franks, who's called in that time period, King Henry, he was King of France during the 1050s, and he became King of France in 1031 after his father Robert died and became king from 996 until 1030. I just check that now. 1031, that's when King Robert II of France died. It was called Robert Pius. I just had to check that out just because memory. Can't remember everything. But King Robert, it was succeeded by his son Henry, who was king from 1031 until 1060. When he first took the throne, he was in a very weak position. King William the Conqueror's father, Robert the Magnificent, who was Duke of Normandy, he was Duke Robert I of Normandy. He supported King Henry during his initial period of rulership, just because when he inherited the crown, he was struggling to maintain his authority. He suffered rebellion from his own brother. And during that time period, when he was very weak, had enormous support, and there also was a war going off between Geoffrey Martel of Anjou, William the second Duke of Normandy, and the Quebec King over dominance. In the 1150s, the table would turn because William of Normandy, William II, William the Bastard, who would become William the Conqueror, he consolidated his control over the Duchy of Normandy He secured a marriage to the Flemish ruling family, the Counts of Flanders, and during that time period, his star was rising. He was becoming more powerful, more influential than the Count of Anjou and the King of the Franks, or King of France, it's known as today. And that's how the conflict between the dynasties started, between the Capet dynasty and the Norman and Plantagenet dynasties that would rule England from 1066 to the conquest. And this conflict was all over control, over influence, and all tried to limit the influence of the King of the English, which the Norman dukes became after 1066, and the King of the Franks. And during that time period, from 1066 until the death of King Henry I, who reigned England from 1100 to 1135, there was conflict between the patient kings and the Norman dukes and also kings of England. And then their successors, the Plantagenet dynasty in 1154, and this kind of cycle of violence, cycle of dominating, trying to get control over different parts of Normandy was a recurring theme until the 17th century, where where English kings, up until the reign of King Henry VIII, attempted to take lands in France, just because if you look at England on a map at that time period, it's still discovered the New World. There have been advancements in technologies of shipping and how to reach those locations. So the only way for the Kingdom of England to expand and prosper, because in then they saw politics and economics as a zero-sum game. There wasn't new wealth being created because the Industrial Revolution didn't happen until 1769, and therefore the way they viewed wealth is a zero-sum game. You can't produce wealth; you can only take wealth from others, and that's exactly what they did. So that's why the Normans and Plantagenets, and then the Tudor dynasty tried to take lands in France to increase their own power. And also, France during this time period is one of the most populous kingdoms in Europe, and a population ranging from between 15 to 25 million, though historians do debate the number, but that number remained pretty much solid up until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. Now, again, the reason why they're so into this territory, not just because it was their ancestral lands, because the kings of England, at one point they controlled half the lands in France. They were dukes of Normandy, counts of Anjou and Maine, dukes of Aquitaine, and had claims to Toulouse, that's in southern France, and also at one point controlled Brittany through marriage. Now, this conflict over control lands in France will culminate in the Hundred Years' War from 1337 until 1453. Yes, I do know it's over 100 years. It's just how it's talked about by historians, how they just mark it out. Well, the 100 Years' War, it wasn't a 100 Years' War. It lasts 100 years. It's just a series of conflicts that spanned over 100 years. And that's why it's called the 100 Years' War, even though it's not 100 years. It's just how it's marked out by historians. The reason for this geopolitical conflict between France and England was because during the late 13th century, a new English king took the throne. He was called King Edward I of England, known to history as Edward Longshanks, which means the tall, and Edward the Hammer of the Scots in popular fiction, and what was called long after his death. During his own lifetime, he was never actually called Edward the Hammer of the Scots. He became King of England in 1272, having succeeded his father, King Henry III, who was king from 1216 until 1272, when he died in 1272. And during that time period, there was peace between the Patient Kings and the Plantagenet dynasty, which ended the 100 Years' War between these both dynasties. There's been several 100 Years' Wars between the English and French over the centuries and millennium. And this war lasted from 1154, though some people place the date a bit later, That's when King Henry II became King of England in 1154, and the Capetian kings of France that ended in 1259 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which were King Henry III of England gave up any claims they had to Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Poitiers, Toulouse, and only left with a strip of land in Gascony. Now, when this peace treaty was signed, it was signed because Louis IX of France, called Louis the Saint Louis of France, Louis IX, he wanted to embark on a crusade to the Holy Land. He embarked on two crusades. One was to Egypt, and the second one in the late 1270s when he died. Saint Louis died in 1270. That was to again to Egypt, where he died of dysentery, along with several members of the French royal family as well, including his brother Alfonso, Count of Poitiers. Now, the after this peace treaty was signed in 1259, from there until 1294, there was peace between the kingdoms of England and the Kingdom of France. But in 1294, King Edward I, he was trying to subjugate and gain total control over the British Isles. He conquered Wales in the 1270s and the 1280s, and then in the 1290s, he was tending to subjugate Scotland. Now, the reason why the regime in France under King Philip IV of France, called the Iron King, who was king from 1285 until 1314, wanted to intervene in this English conquest was one because once England conquered Scotland and secured its back door, because historically during that time period and up until the Act of Union with Scotland in the early 18th century, Scotland traditionally allied with France in order to attack England and gain English lands. Also, the alliance was also used as a way to maintain Scottish independence from the Kingdom of England, because the population of Scotland was only around 400,000 people, and it would stay that size up until the 18th century when there was union between between the parliaments of England and Scotland, because when King James I became King of England in the early 17th century, it united the crowns of England and Scotland with King James I of England, but also the Sixth of Scotland, and that union didn't turn into a parliamentary union until the following century. And it was this conflict over control over Scotland which helped to contribute to the Hundred Years' War, which was also caused by, again, Philip IV creating the Old Alliance, Auld Alliance, that's AULD, or Old Alliance, in the late 13th century. And with that alliance, it maintained, and again, when King Henry III became King of England after the position of his father in 1327, his father was overthrown. Edward II was overthrown. His son Edward III became king. After he threw over his regent and became king, not just in name but in deed as well, he embarked on a campaign lasting 10 years to try and bring the Kingdom of Scotland into the Kingdom of England, try to subjugate Scotland. But Philip VI of France, called Philip the Fortunate, he was preventing English wool merchants from selling wool to Flanders, which was part of the Kingdom of France at that time period. Because of this, it sparked the 100 Years' War, because one, England needed to secure its trade, and the only way Edward III could successfully fight a war against France would be if he claimed the throne of France as well. It was because the lords of France owed the King of France loyalty. In order for Edward to get support within the continent and within France as well, he would need to make that claim, because Philip VI of France is directly descended from Philip III of France, but King Edward IV is a descendant of King Philip IV of France, who was his grandfather. This is because the the Valois takes its dynasty from Charles of Valois. He was Count of Valois. His elder brother, Philip IV. He had three sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. They all died, only leaving daughters, and they was passed over each time. Edward III, he was a descendant of a daughter of Philip IV and Edward II of England. And because females were no longer allowed to inherit the French throne, the crown instead went to Philip VI of France, Count Philip of Valois, and it was through this claim and due to this new president that was only relatively new at the time, just because when King Philip V became, when King Philip V France became king, he prevented his own niece Joan from becoming queen, and that's started the historical precedent of that happening repeatedly, and that's why Edward III had to use that claim so he could legitimize his war against France and not make it just about trade. And that's why the Hundred Years' War started, and why the conflict became a conflict of survival as well. Because at the time, the Kingdom of England had a population of around 5 million people, between 5 and 5.5 million. France was around about 22 million, though again, this number can be debated by historians. And it was very much a conflict of survival, and also about that England only had one direction to go in. It was either in the British Isles or on the continent, and that's why English foreign policy, or the Royal Foreign Policy, from 1066 until the reign of King Henry VIII, who died in 1447, was to gain continental lands. After King Henry died, they Tudor dynasty and preceding English kings of England gave up on any ambition of continental holdings, and came very much throughout from 1248 until the Glorious Revolution of 1688, either a pariah in Europe or irrelevant, just because since the ending of the Hundred Years' War and the impact of the Wars of the Roses from 1455 until 1487, England suffered a loss of prestige and power, as well as suffered financially and was no longer interested in pursuing continental holdings. Now, from this period, from the 16th century onwards, England adopted a foreign policy of isolation, and then a policy of preventing any one power from becoming dominant in Europe. From the late 15th century to the 16th, Europe was being engulfed in the Habsburg Valois Wars. It lasted from 1495 until 1559. This was between the Valois dynasty of France and the Habsburg dynasty of Austria. The Habsburgs, they took control over the Duchy of Burgundy, which is part of the Kingdom of France. They had control of the Duchy of Austria, and they also, through marriage, gained control of the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon, which created a united Spain when Charles V finally took the throne. Now, from 1495 to 1559, the Habsburg dynasty was a rising power in Europe. France, under the late Valois kings, under Louis the 13th, no, Louis the 12th, my apologies, Louis the 12th and Francis the First, they were trying to prevent the Habsburgs from dominating Europe. If you looked at a map of Europe, the Habsburgs controlled on paper all of contemporary Germany, the Netherlands, or the Lowlands, depending which terminology you prefer. They controlled Austria, they controlled parts of Hungary, they controlled Bohemia, they controlled northern Italy, and they controlled the majority of the Spanish Peninsula. And the only nation at the time who could prevent the Habsburgs from dominating the continental Europe was the Valois France. And that's why they engaged in this campaign to try and limit their powers. And this would be a series of conflicts, one of many conflicts from the 16th century onwards, of the continental powers trying to prevent one power from dominating Europe, and that's why during that time period, England faced its first global hegemon, first superpower under the Habsburg dynasty, under its ruler King Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armada in 1588.